Climate Change Risk and Actuarial Approach, hosted by the WBCSD and the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. I'm Rodney Irwin, and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today from London. So good afternoon to everyone from Europe, Middle East, Africa. Thank you to everyone in Asia for bearing with us on what is probably a balmy evening, and good morning to everybody in North, Middle, Central and Southern Americas. So without further ado, I would like to get started. So there are some rules that I would like you to adhere to, and I hope my slides will move in a second. Bear with. So there we are, that's fixed. Make sure your line is muted. There are a lot of people joining this webinar. In fact, it's one of the most registered webinars we've ever had at the WBCSD, so keeping your line muted would be most helpful. If you have questions, please use the question function, which you will see at the bottom of the screen. You can also use the chat function to ask a question by typing your question in the appropriate box. We will be using polling during this webinar, and so we would like you to take part in the polling. And the webinar will be recorded, and it will be distributed after the webinar next week. Well, that's me. You can see me there. That was a recent photograph. I have probably more chins than normal, so apologies. But the main actor today, and the main reason we're all here, is to hear from Nico, who is not unknown to the WBCSD, and we're delighted to have Nico join us again and talk to us about how the actuarial approach to climate change risk is something that we should be all aware of. So without further ado, I just want to set the scene before I hand over to Nico. For those of you that are maybe joining this for the first time and are familiar with WBCSD, I am the Managing Director of a program at WBCSD called Redefining Value. And for those WBCSD members that are online, well, bear with. You've probably seen it before, but I want to set the scene and put the context around why we're hosting this webinar in the first place. WBCSD's strategy is to look at sustainability as an opportunity for business. And through innovation, we want to develop with business solutions that will help drive the transition to a low carbon economy, as well as deal with many of the other environmental and social issues that we are facing as a community on this planet. We are very much aware that the magnitude of the issues require collaboration, and that's why this webinar, in collaboration with the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, demonstrates in some way how we believe that people need to work together to solve many of these problems. And the Redefining Value program, as you can see here, sits trying to bring together measurements and reporting disciplines to allow us to understand if we're on the right track and if we're making the progress to eradicate or at least manage some of the challenges that we are trying to deal with. The vision for Redefining Value comes from WBCSD's Action 2050 publication of 2010, and that is very much aligned with, I think, where many other organisations now see the trajectory for business, and that is that businesses need to be measured by their true value and disclose their true profits and their true costs. And in many ways, that's about understanding the impacts and dependencies that the business has with outside factors such as the environment and society, and being accountable for understanding how they deal with those impacts and dependencies. The program that we have developed is in its third year. It's 2.5 years old, and these are some of the activities that we are doing. And I want to draw your attention to the activity in the middle with enterprise risk management. Now, actuarial science is very different to enterprise risk management, but risk management is at the heart of both disciplines. And WBCSD will also be launching early in January, a new study that is completed and is just being designed as we speak. And I want to give you some insights as to what we've found to whet your appetite for that publication and also set the scene for why we're here today. The Risk Management Project, funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and supported by EY, has allowed us to look at some questions around how businesses look at sustainability issues relative to how they look at risks within the business. Now, the opposite of risk is opportunity, and as I've said at the outset, WBCSD's strategy is very much about looking at sustainability through the lens of opportunity. But missed opportunities present risk to the business, so you cannot look at this without looking at both sides of the equation. So what we have looked at are how are risks being identified, and what frameworks are companies using to identify those risks. We're looking at the relationships between the sustainability function and the risk function if it's not the same, and in most cases it's not. And we're looking at how do those organizations communicate, and what is the outcome of the risk process versus the sustainability process. And we've got some very interesting statistics that I'd like to share with you. The first is that we looked at our members' material sustainability issues, and we looked at our members' legal risk filings in their annual report or in their Form 10K or 20F or other legal vehicle that they have to disclose in their jurisdiction. And what we concluded from that analysis is that there's a less than 1 in 3 chance that your material sustainability issue will be also reflected in the legal filing. That doesn't respect whether or not it's a combined report or an integrated report or a standalone report. There is no, even in integrated reports, we didn't see that there was better alignment than in non-integrated reports. So material sustainability issues were only being reflected in legal filings under risk in less than 1 in 3 instances. However, more alarmingly, we found that 35% of WBCSD member companies had zero alignment between what they considered to be material for sustainability versus what they felt appropriate for disclosure in risk management. 57% of companies did have some alignment. But if you look at the arrows here and the green text that's highlighted, what you'll see is that many of those areas are in what could be considered compliance-related risks. So natural disasters, probably a risk if a company has experienced the effects of adverse weather or other natural disasters, and pollution and accidents and health and safety. The good news is that in 8% of companies we saw full alignment, and this is where the material issues and the risk filings showed a 1-for-1 match. And that has also been quite an interesting examination of what's behind it, because again, there's no one sector or one type of report that's driving that type of alignment. So I hope that's whetted your appetite for what's coming from the WBCSD, but risk is really an important area, and risk management is a friend of sustainability if it's done properly. So I'm going to hand over now to Nico to take us through the work that the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries have been doing in this space. But I would like to just, before I hand over, remind you all that risk management is an important function for WBCSD's RV programme and will continue to be so going forward.
Great, thank you very much, Rodney. So I guess before I start, it's worth just commenting how pleased I am to be here speaking to you all virtually. The partnership that we've had with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development I think is a very important one to us, and delighted to be here speaking to you again. So in this presentation, really I'm trying to do, I think, 2 things. The first is to outline the actuarial approach to managing risk. That's something which is completely generic. It's a process that we can apply to any risk. For those of you not aware of actuaries, we've come very much out of the financial services sector, so we were instrumental in really the foundation and the formation of pensions, the formation of insurance, markets. So this is very much talking about those techniques, the techniques that we use in the financial services sector to manage financial risk, and thinking about how we can bring that to a wider definition of risk management. The second half of my presentation then is really then focusing on climate change risk, and thinking about how that actuarial approach can be applied. As Rodney said, we have some polling questions as we go through. So I think first off, it's worth us just maybe highlighting how actuaries view risk, and I've put a chart here. What I'm trying to draw out is that an actuarial view of risk is not just a single average potential outcome or potential impact of a risk. It's actually thinking about the full range of potential outcomes. So this chart here is showing left to right the potential loss caused by a risk, and then up and down the kind of likelihood of those different levels of loss. So many, let's say, traditional risk functions would look at the average of that, draw a line and consider that risk to be kind of a loss of, say, £60 million with a certain probability. An actuary would say, well, actually, there's a range of potential outcomes. Some of the less likely but very extreme outcomes could be very dangerous to us. So if a risk event was costing us 80 million or 100 million on the right-hand side of the chart, and likewise, as Rodney said, the other side of risk is obviously opportunity. So potentially pricing and valuing the potential profit from a loss of less than that amount. So this is the kind of chart that an insurance company would look at when thinking about how to set an insurance premium. It would set it so that it's got a reasonable chance of making a profit, and then think about the kind of reserves it would need to hold for an extreme kind of outcome. And we think that's a model which can be applied more widely to risk management. So how do we frame thinking about risk? Well, the first thing to say is that the future is uncertain. Sometimes that's quite a challenging comment. Those of us who use models can get beguiled, I think, by the certainty that a model output creates for you. But we know that the future is uncertain, so we need a process to decide what to worry about and how much to worry about that. So the actuarial risk principles that I'll outline now is really intending to provide that kind of process to answer those questions. So before I go on, I just wanted to ask as a polling question whether you were aware of actuaries as risk management professionals. So if we can open the poll. Thank you. So you'll have about 20 seconds if you can click on one of those options now, please. Great. Okay. Fantastic. So you know who we are. 3/4 of you, and 1/4. Yes, we are. We by the end of this session, you will know who we are. So that's great. If I can go back to the slides, thank you very much. So then the actuarial risk management cycle, the actuarial risk principles. It's important to note that this is a cycle. This is a process which you should be repeating. But I'll start by describing the top, so considering the context, then going on to thinking about the system that you're managing, then thinking about ways to measure the risks that you face, and then clearly thinking about how you manage those risks. And then, of course, coming back again to reconsider how that's going and considering whether the context has changed. So it's very much a process that you should be cycling through and repeating on a periodic basis. So focusing in on each of those, when we went through this before, it wasn't clear to everyone. That's a mirror that someone is holding up. Depending on which side of the mirror on, you can either see that that's a square box or a circle box. So the point is that depending on where you're looking, risks can look very different for different stakeholders. So it's really important to go out and engage with your stakeholders and try to understand what their views on risks are and what their objectives on risks are. Some of your stakeholders may be quite aggressive in terms of the desire for you to be taking risks. Some of them may be very conservative. Some of them will note some risks and not others, and others of them will be noting different risks. So getting a view on your risk management process, the risk context that you sit in, is really important to make sure that your stakeholders are brought along. And clearly, with something like climate change, which I'll speak on in more detail in a second, it's really important to understand kind of what your stakeholders are thinking about. Now, in terms of those objectives that your stakeholders might have, clearly at one hand they may be very much thinking about your potential failure in the face of a risk event or insolvency. So that's probably your clients, probably your regulators if you're subject to regulation. They might be focused on you minimising the cost of risk management or the cost of damage due to risks. They might be focused on you maximising profit, which is potentially related but could be quite different. And of course they may also be thinking about different time horizons, and I think that's a really key point that actuaries can help to extrapolate. This isn't just thinking about what the performance of your business looks like over the next quarter. As we'll come on to, some of these issues obviously take decades to come to pass. They might also take decades for you to be able to react to and to protect your business. So understanding the time horizon that your stakeholders have is very important. So moving on then to describing the system. This is a step of an amalgam really between taking data, so external pieces of information, having views and opinions about what that data means, and obviously taking that stakeholder risk map forward, and coming up with a simple model which incorporates those two things and gives you a kind of working hypothesis of how a risk is affecting you and potentially how it can be measured and managed. And I love this quote from Einstein, or attributed to Einstein. No one actually ever heard him say it, but he seems to have written variations on the theme in letters. So when you're thinking about your models in particular, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not one bit simpler. So that's saying don't overcomplicate it, but make sure you capture the key elements that are affecting your risk within your model. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. We have a complicated name for that, which is parsimony. So trying to create things at the right level of technical complexity. So what does this process look like? So as I said, gathering knowledge and data. I think what's really important in here is not just gathering data from people who think like you, but actually to be looking for challenges from the potential data set, from pieces of research. You need to be able to incorporate different views into your process to apply judgment. That's one of the great things that actuarial expertise is about. So look for those challenges. Confirmation bias is very much kind of talking to people who think like you, and avoiding confirmation bias is trying to find points of view which maybe disprove your views. An important piece is to understand the connections between risks, so building mental maps of how risks interact, but also thinking about using those to understand the cascade effects. If you think that a risk event, say, that a fire in a building can be isolated from the function of that building, you're really missing out on some of the most important connections there. So be very aware of how risks interact and potentially how they cascade and make things much worse, much quicker. And then finally, developing a base model. So as I said, make it as simple as possible. But be prepared to test it against reality. Be prepared to look at the external data and see whether your model helps explain it. But don't expect it to explain everything. It is a model, it cannot be perfect. So it needs to be useful to provide interesting insights, but at the same time we can't model every single atom on Earth. We have to do something more simple than that. So it's trying to find the right balance between producing realistic results and at the same time complexity. So moving on to measuring the risk. I think, again, this is where the actuarial viewpoint, I think, is quite distinct. And this chart is really trying to highlight that if you have a single average risk management process, so looking at the average loss, these two lines have averages of somewhere in sort of 50 million, 60 million pounds, average losses. If you have a risk management process which treats both of those risks as the same, then you're going to be missing that on the yellow line, the risk represented by the yellow line, the potential for a very much higher than average loss is a lot higher. So the potential here for losing £100 million on a risk event is going to be 10, 100 times greater than the potential from the yellow line. So very much, again, thinking about the range of outcomes of a risk, the potential range of outcomes, and trying to be clear as to which of those outcomes you're trying to manage. So that kind of self-challenge, I think, is really important. So thinking about what kind of distribution, what kind of probability distribution is relevant. A lot of times, particularly in economic modelling, we see the use of the normal distribution, and that potentially undervalues the extreme events. So it can make you quite focused on a small range in the middle, but actually it's the extreme events where extreme losses are occurring that you need to be most worried. As I said before, you need to be very conscious of the time horizon which is relevant to you. As a commercial business, you might think that it's next quarter's profits that you need to be focused on, but obviously a number of your stakeholders will be wanting to hold your stock, a number of your shareholders, for much longer than that, and they may have a view that they need to be thinking about what your business looks like in 10 years or further out ahead. You also need to be thinking about whether the system itself, the risk that you're looking at, has the potential to be changing. So is the data that you're looking at in the past, was that an outlier? Is that something that challenges the kind of model you're working with, and is that something you'll need to react with in the future? And then finally, a key part of really assessing the size of risks is thinking about stress testing. So stress testing, asking yourself what happens to your institution at a certain level of impact from a risk event, and scenario analysis, essentially trying to reverse that question and say, well, how extreme does a risk need to be for us to for a certain amount of damage to be caused? And the damages there could be insolvency. So again, coming back to insurance companies, any insurance company in Europe is governed by Solvency II. So thinking about being able to survive 1 in 200 a year or 0.5% probability risk events, to have the capital to survive them. So using that to think about what kind of risk events could scupper us and cause us to be an insolvent business. So then finally, managing the risk. Something that I think is really important is to remain focused and not be too distracted by lots of noise. So hence me using this keep calm poster. But really, risk management, I think, comes down to having a clear risk strategy. So being focused on which risks you should be managing and for what purpose. So is it because you think they might be those risks that cause you insolvency, or are they risks which present actually opportunities, so potential sources of profit for you? Controlling the risk, pretty traditional questions of saying whether you kind of mitigate the risk, whether you transfer it, or whether you just accept the risk. But I think really important on the monitoring side is to ask how your risk management strategy is performing, that kind of how am I driving question. And constantly challenge and look for the black swan events, whether they're kind of theoretical, what would happen if type questions, or whether there's the beginnings of some of those cascades of risk, where one risk event might blow up through other risk events coming down the track. So managing the risk, I think, is maybe more consistent with traditional risk management, but framed in thinking about the full range of risk events and their interactions. And I think those are two really important actuarial pieces. Okay. There we go. And then, of course, repeating the process. So, as I said, it's really a cycle of risk management techniques, and at the heart of it is clear communication. So, communication to your stakeholders, communication about what tasks you're doing, and communication about your interpretation of risk. I referenced Solvency II and the 1 in 200 year risk event level. That's a clear area where you know, a risk professional, an actuary, can help interpret that meaning. Not everyone has a full understanding of what 1 in 200 year risk means. So do be aware of how your risk jargon can actually confuse your stakeholders. So clear communication, very important part. Okay, so to round off the first half, what are the differences between the actuarial approach and the more traditional risk management? So first off, you know, risk is not, in our view, just this impact times probability piece. It is really thinking about the full range of impacts at each level of probability. So thinking about the full range of outcomes, and also the full range of interactions between those risks as well. Discussing objectives, risk objectives with all stakeholders, a vital part of the process, making sure that the time horizon is right, making sure that you're able to look beyond the next quarterly earnings or the fulfillment of a shorter term business plan, and of course having the ability to test and reassess models against the real world and the changing real world. So those are the kind of distinctions that we would draw, and the differences of a actuarial risk management approach. Okay, so now back to you for a polling question, and as an introduction to the next section, how seriously is your organisation in preparing for climate risk? So is it, in your view, adequately preparing for climate risk? Is it nearly there? Is it doing a little but very little? Or do you not know at all? So if we could go to the poll, thank you. And we'll have about 20 or 30 seconds to do it. Okay. Okay. So very mixed results. I'm glad to see that there's 15% in the adequately camp, because you never quite know if there's anyone going to be there. Clear opportunities, I would say, for the other 85% of you to obviously be doing more, but also to be getting ahead of your peers. So we'll come on to, you know, the opportunities from managing climate risk, but at the moment only 15% of you are potentially protected from those downside risks, or taking the climate risk opportunities. Okay, so we can go back to the slides. Great. Oh. So then, talking about climate risk, so I always love to put up a slide of the world. This is a NASA image, and it really does show I think, how we're all in this together. So climate change risk is, I think, a very difficult risk for businesses to manage without strong views, partly because of this externalities piece. The key piece that we must all bear in mind, I think, with climate risk is that any carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents that we emit really affects the whole planet. So I always want to kind of go back to that image before talking about climate risk. Okay, so this is a sort of worked example stepping through the risk principles. So this is intended to show a corporation's potential stakeholder map, so and the views that they might have about climate change and climate risk. So first off, talking about governments and regulators. So obviously the Paris process, the Paris Agreement last year said in very broad terms that we need to be getting to a net zero carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide emissions equivalent society by 2050. So there's a clear pressure there from world governments to have that kind of target, and obviously that's on the basis of trying to have a roughly 50-50 chance of a 2-degree of warming world. So your investors have a very different frame. They will be thinking about the return you need to produce for them, but of course they will also be thinking about different time horizons. So those of them focused on a decade hence, so the long-term sort of institutional capital who's invested in you, may well be thinking about how climate risk is going to affect their holdings and be starting to make progress themselves in terms of managing the climate risk on their own assets. So their frame is potentially quite different from regulators. Of course, you have clients and customers. So again, your positioning around climate risk, thinking about how aligned or visible within your brand it is, may certainly in the future start to shape the kind of clients and customers and the loyalty that they show towards your brand. So an increasing brand visibility, I'd say, in terms of climate risk. Of course, you also have suppliers. They wish to make a profit, but they may have different attitudes to climate risk than you. And indeed, you may be potentially a larger organisation than them, so it might be hard for them to manage climate risk. So you do need to ask them what their views on, and try to understand the degree of reliance that they have actually on your risk management. Finally, of course, you have employees, quite similar maybe to your clients and customers, but with potentially slightly different values. They want to work for companies that echo and align with the values that they have. At the moment, again, that might be kind of relatively easy, but as climate risk becomes more important and more visible to society, that might start to diverge. So thinking about what all of these different stakeholders might want is a very important context setting for thinking about how to manage climate risk. And of course, they're all going to be talking about different things. So the core challenge for the corporation in terms of managing this risk is working out who you should be listening to. Now, this is a chart which I presented last year in Paris at your conference, and it comes from the Global Challenges work that we did with the Global Challenges Foundation, which is thinking about, again, this is meant to be a kind of impact and probability distribution, thinking about the extreme risks which can scupper you, or in this case potentially destroy humanity on the planet. So thinking about particularly the regulators and the government's position, they are most concerned about the far right-hand side of the chart. What's the worst outcomes that might come from climate change? And I just always think this is quite a useful way to talk about how different stakeholders might be viewing risk. A number of people might be looking at average amounts of impact. A number of people might be thinking about impact over a shorter term period where the curve could look quite different. But certainly in the view of the Paris Agreement, we should be thinking about these kind of extinction events which potentially we're facing in climate change. So I think what's most interesting with that kind of stakeholder engagement step and thinking about the risk context is that you can't keep everyone happy. There's going to be lots of different views on climate risk, and I'm not just talking about belief on whether it exists or not. Lots of views as to whether you should be mitigating it at reasonable cost, whether you should be managing it at all costs, whether it's just not possible for you as a business, potentially if you're in fossil fuel extraction or other areas like that. So you have to be developing a narrative around climate risk and be very clear about your ambitions. And I think that kind of risk strategy in relation to climate change is very important. So questions I think you should be asking yourself, and I hope that that 15% who felt that they were working hard on climate risk have been through these steps. So questions to think about. So what did you tell your stakeholders about climate change? Did you tell them how much it would affect you? Did you tell them that it was something that you'd be managing over time? Did you demonstrate a plan to them? What were their reactions to that? Is that something where you're expecting, some of your shareholders to say, well, we're not interested in managing climate risk and therefore we'll sell. We see this as an issue for the equity, or is it something that they can be quite positive about? Hopefully it's positive, but you need to be prepared for different reactions. And then I think the question that everyone should be asking is, at what stage will you be prepared for an economy where there are net zero carbon dioxide emissions? That's the clear intent from the Paris process. You need to be framing, I think, that long-term business planning perspective very much in those terms. Okay. So how do we describe the system when it comes to climate change? I've been very keen in terms of talking about this and the IFOA as well to highlight that climate change is coming. So we're not going to stop climate change from happening. I'm sitting in London. We've had 17 degrees temperature this week, and I'm looking outside, and it could be spring. Climate change has really happened, but the question really is, how severe is it going to get, and how can we plan for the consequences of different levels of severity? Now, the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, in his lecture about a year ago called The Tragedy of the Horizons, described 3 types of climate change risk, which I'll go through in a second. But I think that's quite a useful way for businesses to think about how the risk of climate change could be affecting them. So the first one is physical risks. So the impact on really your physical assets. So are they in the right places? Are they at threat from sea level rises? And obviously it's not just the kind of average sea level rise, it's the potential storm impact if you're close to the coast. Are they going to be exposed potentially to greater windstorms? Do you have assets which require water in areas which might be struck by more droughts in future? So you can go through all of your physical assets and work out what kind of climate risks they might be exposed to, and you can effectively audit how prepared you are depending on different levels of impact. And again, it's not thinking about one level of predicted impact, it's actually trying to understand where an impact from climate risk will threaten that asset for you. And then of course there are questions which say, well, can I move those assets? Can I pull my factory over the course of a decade higher up the hill, further away from the sea? Can I move those water intensive industries or agriculture away from areas which might be threatened by drought? And if you can't do that, can you take steps to protect your assets? So either to reduce the damage of climate risks, so thinking about the seawall protection around industry close to the coast, or thinking about freshwater supplies, for instance. Are there ways for you to secure assets which reduce the risk on your ownerships? So I think the physical risk piece is a really useful frame for you to think and step through the potential impacts from climate change on your assets. So the second one is liability risks. Many of you might think this is slightly more speculative, but certainly I agree with the sentiment, and the actuarial profession has been doing a lot of work here. It's trying to say, when, for instance, the island nations are underwater and they're looking for people to sue for the damage of sea level rises, they will be suing people really in line with their contributions to climate change. That's a relatively easy calculation to do, and it comes back to the amount of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases that you have emitted. We don't know if that would be the emissions that you've ever done in the past. I think that's probably quite hard, but certainly the emissions from the date of the Paris Agreement or the ratification of the Paris Agreement, that's the point that everyone should have got the message that there is a very real liability risk coming down to them. So questions to ask yourself, which is, do you know how much carbon dioxide your business is emitting? Do you have an understanding of what emissions that looks like in the future as you plan to become a net zero emitter of greenhouse gases? And are you actually holding reserving assets or insuring for third-party claims? So again, you can go through a relatively kind of well-defined process to work out what your potential liability to climate change litigation is. It's going to be related to the greenhouse gases that you've emitted. The final one, I think, is possibly the hardest to describe in terms of let's say, strategy. Potentially, though, has the greatest opportunity for business. So transition risks are thinking about how you adjust to the low carbon economy. That's going to be a combination of changing policy and technology, but also potentially, as a risk, changing market views on the value of your asset. So if you're someone like a coal extractor, then at the moment there is a value for your assets. A number of entities, a number of institutions might be holding those shares with a plan to dispose them before everyone else does. This is a classic transition risk. Actually, there's a very big chance that everyone will be trying to dispose of those assets at the same time. And those who have a plan to hold, let's say, fossil fuel burning, fossil fuel extraction assets up until just before the point that they become disfavoured may well suffer. So obviously from a financial market side, Mark Carney is very focused on making sure that there is a smooth transition, that we don't have big ramifications in the functioning of markets due to this transition. But from a business perspective, you can be asking yourself, well, what do you need to do to green your business and to protect your business, and how quickly can you actually put that in place? Is that going to produce intellectual property for your business, which actually is going to have a greater value in terms of you selling it on or licensing it into other businesses? Thinking about that asset price and sentiment piece, do you believe that there is a threat to the asset values that you hold from changing sentiment, and are you actually expecting and planning to react before that sentiment change happens, or are you relying on your ability to invest passively, and you'll sort of walk through whatever asset changes happen? So that's the transition piece. Okay, so I wanted to go for a polling question again. So really, yes, no answer. Does those 3 risk definitions, risk frames, help you manage and report on those risks better? So if we could open the poll. Thank you. Okay. Oh. Ah, fantastic. There we go. the 3% of you see me after, right? Great. Okay. So yeah, if you could put back onto my slides, thank you very much. Okay. So measuring the risk. This is a chart that I showed when I was in Paris with you. These are estimates from the fourth assessment report of equilibrium climate sensitivity. So that's the amount of warming that a doubling of the carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents in the atmosphere will cause. Now, you can see that a lot of the peaks, a lot of the highest probability is sort of towards the left of the chart. But those lines in the bit on the bottom of the chart and the dots show where the average is. And even just thinking about the averages, there's quite a big range. Now, an actuary looks at that chart and says, wow, there is a lot of uncertainty. And therefore, you could produce a sort of consolidated view of those and be asking yourself, well, do we need to be worried about, let's say, 4, 5, 6 degrees of warming type impacts, and how likely would those be? And you know, a simple review of that chart would say they're not beyond the bounds of possibility. There's going to be potentially a 5–10% chance of that kind of level of warming if we only get away with doubling the amount of carbon dioxide relative to pre-industrial levels. So you do need to have processes to be thinking about the full potential range of impacts. And of course, it's not just about average temperatures. It's also about extreme temperatures or extreme weather. So this is a chart called the Actuary's Climate Index. This is an initiative we're launching in North America next year, and we're hoping that it will be launched in Europe soon after. And this looks at deviations from sort of average weather, which is high temperatures, low temperatures, extreme high precipitation or drought, high winds and high seas, as a deviation from a sort of baseline period between 1961 and 1990. And you can see, so the blue bars are where the deviations were negative, i.e. there was less extreme weather in the quarter than the average, and the red bars are where there is more extreme weather. And you can see really since the end of the baseline period, there's been very, very few quarters where there has been less extreme weather than the average of that kind of period. So quite a stark message. Actually, you know, this is saying that the effects of climate change were visible in terms of extreme weather from the mid-90s kind of onwards. And in terms of purpose, we think of this in two ways. So firstly, this is a kind of warning system so that we can very much try and visualize and communicate the impacts of climate risk and demonstrate how severe it potentially is already. And then secondly, it's potentially a financial, the baseline for a financial derivative. So you could write an insurance policy, you could write some sort of an option strategy using the ACI as a baseline. And obviously when extreme weather was higher, you would potentially get a payout from that option or insurance policy, and when it was low, you'd potentially not get that. So that's a tool that we've developed to help measure the risk of climate change, and one, as I say, that we'll be releasing next year. So trying to bring that together, I think the physical risk and an assessment of physical risk, you know, is potentially quite laborious for you. You know, large organisations may have many tens, many hundreds, potentially thousands of sites. But you can follow that as a relatively kind of well-managed process and assess the potential damage from climate change on each of those sites. As I said, the transition risk piece takes views. You need to have views around potentially your valuation of assets or potential for you to green your business. But really, assessing liability risk, I'd say, is easy, and I did put it in inverted commas. But you know, the liability is going to be linked to the amount of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents that you emit. We will be having some tools from the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures imminently. And all I can really say to you is to get on with those assessments and start baselining where you are. Okay, so the final step then is managing the risk. So I think most important is for you to have a plan for reducing the amount of carbon dioxide you emit, and that can be in line with your nationally determined contributions for your local nation, or indeed beyond. You know, it's just because America has elected a climate cynic as president does not mean that the UN is going to reverse the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement essentially says by 2050, if we're still emitting carbon dioxide, there will not be any humans on the planet by 2100. I do not believe for a second that any other nation is going to be reversing its policy on that, and indeed America will be, I think, unable to export products which emit carbon dioxide into the future. So if you have a country which, or part of a country which doesn't have an aggressive nationally determined contributions, it may be a benefit to your international trade to actually be reducing the amount of embedded carbon dioxide in your products. So set a plan then also for reducing your exposure to physical risks, so know where your assets are and where they need to be. And most importantly, be ready to answer the stakeholder question, which is how is your business going to be affected by climate change, and have a plan to reduce that impact. We've seen a number of countries start to put requirements for owners of equity into law to be asking these kinds of questions. And again, I think we have to believe that they're only going to be gathering pace. So to wrap up, don't ignore climate risk because it will not ignore you. We cannot bury our heads in the sand in this. Work out what you need to be doing to protect your business. Keep on reassessing those plans as new evidence comes out. You might look at a physical risk on an asset and think that it's kind of acceptable. Different modelling, different changes to how precipitation has over the region has changed. That might alter that plan. So do keep those plans close and reassess them. I think you should all be anticipating an acceleration of government pressure on climate change. As I say, it sort of doesn't matter what America does on this. I think every other nation is very conscious of this, and it's very hard to see that you know that pressure could be eased in future. And engage with your stakeholders as to what their needs are. Okay, so before I go, one last poll for you. So do you think this approach could help you to manage risk better? So potentially offers a major improvement, minor improvements, or you don't know? Okay. Okay, great. So good 80% of you, I think, could see it as useful. If I can, well, if we go straight back onto the next poll question, if I could. So I promised one poll, but I had to. Would you consider using an actuary for this risk assessment, risk management process? If that's a straight yes, no answer, if I can go to the poll. Okay. Fantastic. Excellent. Brilliant. So just back to my slides. So then I've put some links on here. If you are interested in finding out more about the actuarial profession and how we can play a role in managing risk, please do contact Matthew. So his email address is there. We have the link to the risk principles document, so that outlines a bit more about the risk principles, and then a host of different pieces that we have on the IFA website about what we do. So I'll hand over now to Rodney. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nico. That was fantastic. I'm very impressed by the number of participants on the call who said that they would be interested in working with actuaries on this subject going forward. And at the WBCSD, as I've already mentioned at the outset, we are heavily involved in developing a risk management project, which we've already done research on to establish a baseline of where we are with respect to disclosure, and we've done research by speaking to our members as to how they currently look at risk. And many of the issues that Nico raised are similar to what we've heard when we've spoken to our members around the timelines that currently boards are looking at in terms of planning versus the timelines that risks of this nature present, or resulting in these risks not even being, if they are identified, not being prioritized for action. But as I've said as well, and Nico has also presented in a much more visual way, this risk is real and it is happening. So what are we going to do? I think that's still yours, but I will move on from that because I'm not an actuary and would dread to be getting any technical questions of that nature. So I think the first thing to be aware for everyone that's on the line is that next Wednesday is a very important day, and that's when the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is under the auspices of the Financial Stability Board, and they report to the G20 finance ministers, will publish their Phase 2 report on recommendations following the year-long project that they've ran to look at how companies can deal with climate transition or climate change transition. WBCSD will review and examine in detail both the report and any appendices that come with it, and we will host webinars in the second week of January. The dates are not confirmed yet for the simple reason that we're trying to confirm attendance of members of the task force to those webinars. And we will hope to offer 2 webinars, one early in the morning so that our members from Asia will be able to join, and one later in the day so that our members from both sides of the Americas can join as well. And of course Europe, you're welcome to join. Europe, Middle East, Africa, you're welcome to join either. This will be an informative webinar to explain what is in the draft report, and it is also a webinar where we will put forward what the WBCSD's potential response will be to the consultation, and we would like our members to help us determine whether we're on track. So please just make a note that somewhere in the second week of January we will be having these webinars, and we will get the dates to you next week. In addition, the reporting exchange will go live on Monday. The reporting exchange, some of you may not be aware of, is a web-enabled knowledge platform that allows people that are interested in sustainability reporting to understand what reporting provisions exist, and which would also potentially give you insights as to how to comply or report against those provisions. So a lot of work has gone into this. There are 31 countries that will go live on Monday, with another 9 joining between now and the beginning of next year. And during the next 4 months, this system will be open and you can play with it and provide us your feedback. It's still in development and we need your inputs to be able to make a more robust system. So go to reportingexchange.com and register your interest in taking part in the beta version. It's no cost, so it's a free gift for Christmas. And take part, get involved, and provide us your feedback. It only leaves me with to say have a great Friday and a great weekend, and to express my sincere thanks to the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, and in particular to Nico for all the work that he's done, and to Matthew, who you haven't met, who behind the scenes has made this happen, and to Andy and Maddie and Geneva, thank you for the technical support. So signing off from London, and have a great weekend. Bye.